If you believe X, Y, and Z, are you then either explicitly or implicitly committed to believing in A, B, and C? And if you do believe them, do you believe there is an interrelationship that rigidly binds these six positions? And if this is so, are you an ideologist? Do you believe in a system of political thought that tends to comprehend all important social questions, giving the answers to all important social problems? It is commonly conceded that the word ideology began seriously with Karl Marx, who promulgated a political cosmology. But there are many other ideologues, feminists, racists, even anti-racists, perhaps even libertarians. The purpose of this hour is to explore the theory and uses of ideology, asking specifically whether there is such a thing as an ideology of conservatism. To which end we have invited Mr. Kenneth Minogue, whose latest book is called Alien Powers, The Pure Theory of Ideology. Professor Minogue is a very famous political scientist, acclaimed especially in Great Britain, where he is professor of political science at the London School of Economics. Mr. Minogue was born in New Zealand, went to the University of Sydney, and took advanced degrees from the London School of Economics. He has lectured widely in many countries, served as Dean of Undergraduate Studies at LSE, and is the author of The Liberal Mind, Nationalism, and the Concept of a University. Our examiner is Mr. Joseph Sovereign, senior editor of National Review and syndicated columnist, about whom more in due course. I'd like to begin by asking Ms. Minogue, is an ideologue, or an ideologist as you like, required to believe in an oppressor class?
I cannot imagine a proper ideologist who didn't. But there I run into an enormous difficulty. The word ideology is hard to pin down because it's a pompous, pretentious word, and people who simply want to talk about doctrines or ideas think it's flashier to talk about ideology. And therefore, anybody who believes in general principles is often described as an ideologue or an ideologist.
Improperly.
Well, how people use the word is something that you have to accept.
There's a law save usage.
You simply have to accept that. And therefore, I have had the problem in charting ideology of trying to work out where the core lies. And certainly in answering your question, I think the true ideologist undoubtedly believes in an oppressed class, because the other side of ideology is always liberation. That is, one of the ways in which you can define ideology is that it is a theory of the practice of liberation. So liberation and oppression go together.
Well, is the oppressing class necessarily animate?
Yes, it would have to be.
So the state would have to be animate then. I'm thinking of the libertarians, Herbert Spencer, Albert J. Nock et al., who think of the, and to a certain extent Milton Friedman, think of the state as the oppressor. But the state obviously is an agent of human beings, right? So it is they who are the oppressors rather than the state in order to conform with your definitions?
The state as an oppressor is, of course, anarchist ideology. All anarchists believe that it's government that causes violence rather than the threat and fear of violence which causes government. It's characteristic, however, of most ideologists that they think that the oppressor class is half conscious of its oppressing status and half fooled by its own rationalizations. Mm-hmm. And therefore you could have
totally
government.
Orwellian, isn't it?
No, not in the least.
Well, no, Orwellian in the sense that Big Brother was at least half convinced that he was a major benevolence in 1984, right?
I rather doubt that that's what Orwell meant. I think Orwell was turning ideology itself into a melodrama. But I think one of the strengths of ideology is that it purports to be scientific. Mm-hmm. In purporting to be scientific...
One of the pseudo-strengths.
Well, strengths in the sense of being persuasive.
Oh, yeah,
right. The point of ideology is it must persuade people. It is a set of ideas designed to take people up. Mm-hmm. And it is most persuasive if it appears to be scientific. And in being scientific, it's generally a theory about the essential nature of the state. or the essential nature of the capitalist class,
Yeah.
or the essential nature of men in patriarchy. And that essential nature isn't necessarily connected to the thoughts that run through their heads. Indeed, the thoughts that run through their heads are frequently innocent or justificatory. So it's a theory independent of what the oppressor actually thinks he's doing.
Well, account, as you do in your book, but account for us the extraordinary paradox that on the one hand, ideology affects to be scientifically establishable. On the other hand, empirical data are at war with ideological presuppositions. The most obvious example of this, I would guess, would be agriculture in the Soviet Union. People know that in a free agricultural system there's usually abundance. The Soviet Union exported grain up until 1917, has had droughts every year since. Now, given that they simultaneously need to search out scientific truths and are bombarded by empirical results that contradict those truths they seek out, how is it that they manage?
Now that's a very complicated question. In Popperian terms, of course, a scientific theory has to be refutable. It has to be a set of, Karl Popper believes quite rightly that a scientific theory has to be a set of propositions which you can go out into the world and test. Mm-hmm. You can say, is the world a bit like that? And you can be proved wrong. An ideology is obviously not like that. It's a set of propositions which are very carefully insulated from testing.
A priori.
A priori, yes. Marx invented the notion of scientific socialism, and I think that when we talk about ideology, it's always best to take one's bearings from Marx, because he's undoubtedly the genius who created this highly special form of thought. And as he came into political controversy in the 1840s, the best grip he could take upon it was to say, other socialists or communists have merely been advocates of utopias, of an ideal society. I am presenting to you a theory, and the theory is scientific socialism, so that for most of Marx's lifetime, the claim was made that Marxism was scientific socialism. It's made by Engels, for example, at the graveside address. But the true logic of ideology, as I've tried to argue in Alien Powers, is that the ideology must be a total revelation which gets behind everything that modern society produces. And therefore the development of, say, Marxist ideology in the last 100 years has included criticism of science as being part of the technocratic, instrumental rationalism of a capitalist society, so that ideology eventually has to present itself as a body of knowledge which is transparent and superior to science, philosophy, religion, to all other ideas whatsoever.
Well, would an application of this point lead the ideologist, the Marxist, to say, I can account for the productivity of free agriculture here in exactly equivalent geographical circumstances and the lack of productivity here by using a scientific knowledge that transcends the knowledge on which these empirical data are otherwise received? If so, how does he accomplish that?
Well, obviously, I don't think he can, and you don't think he can either. It can't be done. And it's very complicated to explain.
But he has to be persuasive.
He has to
I know it can't be done in the sense that you and I would rule that he had come through with an objectively defensible performance. How does he attempt to do it?
I'll tell you what he would do. What he would say is that the essence of capitalism is that it is a crazy, out-of-control, productive system which is always producing, it's spilling vast numbers of surpluses onto the market and dominating the minds of people so that they acquire false needs, so that they'll gobble them up. But if you look at American agriculture, currently it's overproducing. The common market is overproducing in agriculture. Now, there may indeed be certain technical problems about socialist agriculture because we are in the midst of building a socialist society, and perhaps human beings under socialism have not yet acquired that sense of communal loyalty which allows us to produce food adequate to the needs of the people. Perhaps not quite, but we are at least building a rational system, whereas this is merely part of the weird irrationality of capitalism. I think that would be a proper ideological reply to that kind of objection.
And suppose I were the adversary in this exchange, and I were to say, well, the difficulties the common market has, and the difficulties that the American agricultural market have are directly traceable to interventions by the state, and therefore aren't really authentic evidences of capitalist machinations.
You would think you would have scored a point. My ideologists would not a chance, because what you would not have realized is that the state itself is, as Marx said in the manifesto, the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Therefore, the way in which the state in the current condition of capitalism is responding to the needs of different producer interests within it, and that is why it is intervening, and that is the state is itself part of the irrationality of capitalist production.
Right. Well, is it required of every ideology that it be redemptive, that it have an eschatological purpose, i.e., if we all become Marxists, then all kinds of beautiful things happen, right?
Yes.
Now, therefore, the enemy of that kind of thought would be liberalism in the antique sense of the word, right? Why?
Well, the big divide is between people who believe in the practical world as it is and the human nature we must accommodate to, and who accept the political tradition of the West, and what you call redemptive doctrines. These are doctrines of liberation, and these are beliefs that the world we live in is the most cunningly disguised form of oppression and domination the world has ever seen, that the business of life is to become conscious of it, which is adopting whatever ideological theory is to be recommended, and in that way to fight for liberation. And I think the key word here is liberation. Because Western political thought has always been preoccupied with freedom, but it's always been concerned with the assumption that people are free. You see, there's a very interesting passage in Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, in which he pours contempt upon the whole idea of liberation. He says that it is impossible for slaves ever to liberate themselves. They will simply create another slave state. And I think this is a central point in ideology, because free peoples never liberated themselves. That is, the British never liberated themselves. The Americans never liberated themselves. The premise of the American War of Independence was not that the Americans were an oppressed people rising up to be free. They were already free, but they wanted a different set of political arrangements. They wanted to govern themselves. The British, again, never struggled for freedom. They were never slaves in any way. They acquired the habit of free living over a long period of time, so that the idea of liberation is almost the opposite of the idea of freedom. And
well, let me explore that a little for a moment. The indictment phrase in those opening sentences, Declaration of Independence, directed a finger at King George and said that he was oppressing the people of the colonies, right?
Yes, by taxing.
Oh, by doing what things? He listed 13 or 14 things of which he was guilty. Now, why would that not be accusing him of oppressing them?
Well, it's not oppressing them in the same sense that an ideologist means. That is, this is a claim about injustice, that the governing of the colonies, it was claimed, was unjustly being done, that there were a series of grievances they had. This was in no way the suggestion that we have hitherto been enslaved, and we are now rising up to claim a freedom which will be a different kind of condition altogether.
So I see. So in other words, they didn't conceive of themselves as in that state of servitude that
not in the least
is required in the vocabulary of ideologists.
George III they conceived of, to put it technically, as a tyrant, but not as a master or a despot, and that's a crucial thing. Again, you see the English, who from at least the early in the 18th century were regarded by Europeans as having a special vocation for liberty. never struggled for it or acquired it by struggle. That is, they after Anglo-Saxons and Normans came together in England, they developed institutions like juries and parliaments. Magna Carta, for example, is not a set of people rising up to claim freedom. It's a reassertion of liberties which they believed that they had enjoyed from time immemorial.
Yeah.
So the important point, I think, is that the whole idea of liberation is essentially implausible. And it's implausible, I think, because Marxism and most forms of communism are really designed for a relatively unsophisticated set of people, and a set of people who obviously are not familiar with what you might call sophisticated Western political thought.
Well, how is it that Marxism, in fact, continues to appeal to a number of highly educated people, or are there subtle transformations in its meaning as they espouse it? Are they using it really as a metaphor?
No, I don't think they're using it as a metaphor. The question of its appeal is extremely complicated. You see, Marxism and all other doctrines, I think, are essentially forms of revolutionary praxis. Mm-hmm. They want to they respond, amongst other things, to a passion for change. Yeah. So that anybody who feels in any way discontented with life in the modern world, and you might well say the human condition is full of discontents, may in principle be mobilized by whatever purports to theorize your discontent.
Whatever galvanizes it.
Exactly.
Liberation theology would be another example, wouldn't it?
Well, liberation theology is the conversion of religious ideas into ideology, with a sort of light theological gloss. But again, the liberation idea is, of course, the key to all of this, I think.
Well, it's an attempt to really baptize Marx, isn't it, in a sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. However, your book maintains that whatever form it takes, its essential profile doesn't change. It is redemptive. It is comprehensive. It stresses liberation on oppressor class, on oppressed class. How would feminism, for instance, be described by your reckonings?
Well, feminism is the discovery that women have made at the present epoch that they have always been an oppressed class. Yeah. And it is simply the application of the ideological line of argument to the condition of women. Now, the ideological line of argument is a set of moves which always arrive at an absolutely prefabricated standardized conclusion, namely that something that you have previously thought was perhaps a free and equal relationship is actually a disguised form of domination. That judges, lawyers, husbands, whites, industrial firms, employers, priests, whatever is analyzed in ideological terms is converted into the discovery that's always made as the result of ideological criticism is that domination has happened. It's a bit like King Midas, you know, the king who everything he touched, he turned to gold with rather fatal results. Whatever an ideologist touches, he discovers to be dominatory.
Yes, as a matter of fact, on this program about 10 years ago, Bernadette Devlin was struggling with a cigarette, so I reached over and lit it. and she said, "Oh, thank you." And she was obviously mortified at having thanked me, because after the program was over, she said, "That was the most disgusting act of male aggression I've ever seen." And so I've had one vivid experience with it. Well, there's a sense in which calling a chairman a chairperson is supposed to liberate, is it? By the terminology.
Yes, it liberates by the terminology, but there another important point about ideology is involved, and that is that the minds of human beings reflect their circumstances. And if you use the word chairman, you are reinforcing this dominatory situation. But if you change the language, then this will be reflected, clickety-click, in the minds of people.
Heightening, right?
Exactly. It's part of the engineering of consciousness, so that ultimately all the media of consciousness, like language and what you see and what you experience, will reflect the ideal condition of things.
Well, it's one of the points that you make in your book that a false claim of ideologists is that genuine consciousness is enhanced by running it through an ideological strainer, correct? Your, your point being that actually it's diminished because it's a conscript consciousness, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, what is meant by, in feminist terms, by raising consciousness is accepting the abstract theory of feminism.
Yeah.
And the very move from theory to consciousness reveals the perceptual theory of knowledge involved in ideology, because the essential idea is that you open your eyes, clarified by ideology, and you see reality as it is. Similarly, proletarian consciousness is what the proletarian ought to see. Now, no proletarian has ever seen quite what Marx, a highly educated, philosophically inclined descendant of rabbis, ever saw, but Marx thought that he had worked out what was the proper consciousness for a proletarian. The word consciousness, you see, what one needs in order to understand ideology is an attention very specifically to the types of words they use. I was walking through New York yesterday, and there's a poster on the wall. I made it. I made it, and a poster claiming that Reagan and Mondale are agents of capitalism and so on. At the top of this poster were the simple words, "the truth." Now, it's that kind of claim to sheer transparency which is one of the charming secrets of ideology, and one of the reasons why it's extremely popular.
Well, as I understand it, consciousness used by ideologists is equated with an objectification of what it is that's being seen.
Yes.
So that a chairperson, the use of the word chairman would be an objectification of man's efforts to subjugate women.
Exactly.
Now, given that you have the difficulty of seeking simultaneously to be scientific, they run into the same difficulty there, do they not? I.e., that objectification is ultimately a hallucination.
Ah, no. The theory of science that's involved, to the extent that they claim to be scientific, is a kind of Baconian theory of science, which is that you understand the world by looking at it. And ultimately it's perceptual. It's a form of empiricism. The problem is that from the time when class-divided societies arose, then dominatory ideas also arose. And dominatory ideas were words like heaven, God, priest, king, authority, the entire vocabulary of law, religion, philosophy, etc. And these ideas came between the human mind and nature and man. And it's the removal of these ideas. This is the original ideology. See, there's a fish, I gather, called a stickleback, which characteristically is set upon by a parasite which works its way through the fish and lodges in the eye. And the stickleback's vision, if I have my zoology right, is systematically distorted by the presence of this parasite in the eyeball. And Marx, using the analogy of a camera oscura, suggests pretty much the same thing. And the point of an ideology, it's a bit like psychoanalysis, you see. Raising consciousness means removing these ideas which are inadequately founded in a reality which you can perceive. And once you remove these ideas, then the truth is visible to you. So I do not think you can overemphasize the extent in ideologies to which its knowledge is based on perception.
Well, it's based on an ideologized perception, right? You are certainly not allowed to perceive that which is heretical.
Of course. What you perceive always is domination. The point is that in the societies in which ideology is likely to be cultivated, the essence of them is domination. And therefore you will understand that even when a charming chairman lights your cigarette for you, this is actually an act of domination. Now, that anecdote that you told is extremely revelatory of what seems to me to be the essence of ideology. It is a fundamentalism which is always, which masquerades as realism, you see, because one of the characteristic remarks of an ideologist is something like it would be naive to believe that this, that, or the other. And naivete, the concept of naivete, is a highly technical expression in ideology, which means accepting the justifications of the oppressive society in their own terms.
That's right. St. Thomas would be naive by the standards of Marxist ideologists.
Very.
Yeah. Well, now, tell me how ideology is used in race relations. We've discussed feminism. Is an example of ideology the notion, say, that all of the difficulties suffered by Indians are the result of their having been colonized by whites or blacks or whatever?
That's the theory of imperialism, and there are various theories of racism which would attribute all the sufferings of blacks to what whites have done to them. There are many versions with different races coming up on top.
But they're all ideological in character.
Well, to be ideological in character is to construe oppressors and oppressed. Whenever that happens, whenever you have a theory that the things that people suffer from are the results of an entire system, then you have an ideology. You see, there is no doubt that people do inflict all sorts of grievous harm upon each other, and therefore one has to distinguish between a real case that such and such a set of people have been extremely unjustly treated by another set of people, and there's no doubt that this happens, from the ideological claim which theorizes the whole thing in terms of a system.
Well, there, intelligent, non-ideological observers have to make the distinction, right? There is no doubt for those who have read or seen, say, a passage to India, that that particular colony of whites were oppressive in their behavior and disdainful in their views of the people who were colonizing. On the other hand, you wouldn't say as much about Mother Teresa acting in a different context in the same country.
Mother Teresa could hardly be said to be oppressive. No, I don't know.
But she would be. Would she not, by the true ideologist, in the sense that she is sowing a belief in a system that plays into the hands of religious oppressors, no?
Yes, I suppose she would, because the characteristic of an ideology is that everything must be theorized.
There can't be an innocent party.
I'm not altogether sure that the British in India under the Raj are entirely oppressive. I mean, they may have been a rather boring, disdainful, contemptuous lot in their relations with the Indians. On the other hand, they operated in terms of civil law.
Well, yeah, and India was a much more pleasant place to live after the English got there than it was before. I mean,
it might well be argued that way, yes, certainly. I think it's plausible to say so.
It would be hard to argue the opposite, certainly, given the situation there in the early part of the 19th century. Well, now, okay, what about the use of ideology in the academy? Is the notion of academic freedom, as commonly enunciated, ideological, or is it exactly the opposite of ideological?
Well, from an ideologist's point of view, academic freedom is simply part of the structure of capitalist society. You see, in capitalist society, you have universities performing the knowledge-gathering and conceptualizing functions which will serve for the reproduction of knowledge of the system. So academic freedom is simply another of those things that conduces to the dominatory system. Hence, the ideologist in the universities regards himself as above all critical, because what he's doing is exposing that. On the other hand, see, ideologists in universities are in a difficult position in that nearly all of them are, in one degree or another, perfectly academic. That is, they understand what the academic rules of the game are. On the other hand,
the scientific method
and so on. On the other hand, they tend to regard, for example, the division of academic inquiry into disciplines as being a version of the oppressor's tactic of divide and rule. You see, economics is cut off from sociology, and you get abstract axiological theories of rational agents choosing and responding to prices and so on. Sociology is to some extent studying the irrationalities of people in relation to class and status and so on. A Marxist ideologist, for example, would think that his Marxism is superior to both because it puts them together into a single system and theorizes the whole system. But of course, the ideologist theorizes the whole system as an evil system, so that there's a set of values built into the whole thing right at the start.
Well, now, would we reach in the Academy a collision point between the ideologist and the nihilist? It seems to me that the doctrine of academic freedom sometimes seems to be telling you that nothing is knowable. You get the relativism of people like John Dewey, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and they are really saying all ideas must start even in the race, because it is presumptuous for any professor to, for instance, say that there is more to be learned from studying the moral intimations of the Declaration of Independence than of the Manifesto of Karl Marx. But now the people who object to that are insisting that among the responsibilities of the Academy is to forward a tradition and to secure the patrimony. So
yes, academic freedom certainly doesn't mean that all ideas are equal, because amongst one of the consequences of academic criticism is, of course, the discarding of a lot of ideas as being
yes, but John Stuart Mill said as long as anybody believes that they have not been satisfactorily discarded, then you can't say that they have been discarded, right?
No, and indeed, even if they're wrong, it's worth allowing them to be raised again, because the exercise of arguing against falsity strengthens the truth. John Milton
that's
took
a
the same
discipline.
view. That's a discipline.
That's a discipline, but Mill, as I remember, said you can't consider that a particular proposition has erred if anybody believes it to be true.
Yes, well, this is the skeptical ground of freedom. Oh, now why nihilist? You see, the skeptical ground...
Because in point of fact, nothing can be thought to be untrue, because you can always find somebody who believes anything, can't you?
Oh, indeed. Descartes said that there is no absurdity such that you can't find one philosopher or another who has believed it. No, the real crux of academic freedom is, of course, that it's impossible to discover anybody whom you would want to trust who could declare this theory is true or that theory is unambiguously false. It's a recognition of the fact that a modern society consists of large numbers of people with rather different ideas about what's true and what's desirable.
Doesn't it?
Oh no, because you don't make that your criterion of truth. Your criterion of truth is logical, but your criterion of what can be said is that anybody wants to say it.
Well, Holmes would not have agreed with that. I mean, he said the test of truth is its ability to gain the sponsorship of the marketplace.
This is the judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes, is it?
Yes.
Yes. I wouldn't take my doctrines about truth from a judge.
No, I certainly would not. But
they're not great epistemologists.
What I'm saying is that there's a nihilist strain that finds academic freedom a very useful ally, and that what you end up with is nescience. You cannot know anything.
But what you're saying is that academic freedom can be misused for bad purposes, and that's true, but I don't know what can't be misused for bad purposes. Everything can be used for bad purposes. The important thing, I think, is to clarify what academic freedom is and what its value is. Its value is probably, you see, there isn't now much difference between academic freedom and any other kind of freedom. 100 years ago, academic freedom was needed, for example, by lecturers in medical schools talking about the anatomy of sex, because if you said things that professors of medicine said outside a university, that they said inside a university, they'd have been run in for obscenity, so that you needed academic freedom in that way, because social conventions were much stricter. But now I don't know that there's any vast difference, is there, between the freedom of an academic and the freedom of any citizen. They say, and are free to say, exactly what they feel like saying.
Yes, but the point I'm trying to make is that one should object to a celebration of that part of academic freedom that conduces to nescience, even as one should not celebrate the fact that the First Amendment, malgré soi, permits decide, right?
Yes.
But there is a lot of, there is a high reliance on democracy and on academic freedom and other things that we tend to believe in order to push positions which are the opposite of ideology, in that they say nothing can be believed. Intellectual anarchy, really, isn't it?
Ideology is quite inclined to take up these positions that nothing very much can be believed. I mean, for certain purposes, ideologies are curiously idealistic in spite of their realistic front. But that's a very complicated point. I would revert simply to saying that academic freedom, like anything else, can be misused, and I don't know how one would construct a foolproof version of academic freedom which would guarantee what's good in it and prevent villains and knaves and fools from misusing it. That's where the problem lies, of course. The further point is that a modern society like our own is a kind of bizarre adventure in which we move from generation to generation, loosening restraints which people in previous generations would have thought absolutely essential to maintaining a society. And at every loosening of restraints, somebody has said, it can't last, we shall fall apart. And so far, to an astonishing extent, and America is, of course, above all the laboratory of this, to an astonishing extent, the country has, the society manages to survive and prosper. Now, we don't know how far this process can go, and I certainly sympathize with people who say, perhaps it's gone far enough, and we ought to be very cautious about the restraints that we continue to loosen. But
what comes primarily to mind is the idea of authority?
Yes, I think the idea of authority is absolutely essential to sustaining a modern society, because the only alternative is the idea of reason, and that simply introduces zealots and fanatics into the game, whereas the thing about authority is that a person with authority can say, you must do that because I have authority, which is not the same as saying, I'm infallible.
So, in other words, there need not be any internal assent in doing what the person in charge, whether he's a professor or a lieutenant,
that's exactly the point. Yes, you don't have to have internal assent. Obedience will do.
Well, let's turn to the Examiner. Mr. Sobran, as I've said, is a senior editor of National Review and syndicated columnist, a graduate of Eastern Michigan University, who did graduate work there in English. He is columnist carried by Universal Press Syndicate. He's a commentator on CBS's Spectrum. Mr. Sobran.
Mr. Minogue, I enjoyed your book very much and learned a great deal from it. Bill's anecdote of Bernadette Devlin reminded me of another one that illustrates, I think, the interconnectedness of everything under the ideological view. I saw a headline in a radical feminist newspaper a few years ago that said, "Why the Nestle's boycott is a lesbian issue."
You haven't told us why.
I forget, but it was pretty convincing. I understand you to be saying that that ideology is inherently subversive of any real social order. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, we have a case where ideology has come to power. We have a number of cases, but the Soviet Union is the main one, of course. The general presumption is that there's a certain cynicism among Soviet rulers that Mr. Gorbachev didn't get his new job by passing a civil service exam on the labor theory of value. But how totally cynical can they be? In what sense do they believe in their ideology, or is that the wrong category, believe?
That's a very difficult question to answer, and also, of course, a very interesting one. The point that I would want to make on it is that all ideologies, like Marxism, are forms of revolutionary praxis. The genius, Marx, is extremely clear on that. Therefore, their natural habitat is being persecuted and being used by some set of people who want absolute and total power to transform a society completely into something different. Now, they found themselves in the slightly unfortunate position of acquiring power in, of course, many cases in the 20th century from the Soviet Union onwards. And once they've acquired power, the results have, of course, been horrific, because you then begin to see what's involved in trying to create a homogeneous system. It means killing the people who don't fit, and therefore homicide on a colossal scale has normally followed this. And what results is usually a fixed elite. The nomenclatura in the Soviet Union, to a lesser extent the whole Communist Party itself, become a privileged class. And you get something which Marx and Marxists declare is impossible, namely one set of people with power simply dominate and exploit another set of people, and it has nothing to do with the mode of production. I mean, the way in which they produced cars or ball bearings in Magnitogorsk is exactly the same as the way in which they produce them in Detroit, more or less, give a certain amount of efficiency. So it becomes simply an exploitative system. People's capacity for belief is always remarkable. They can often have two contradictory beliefs, one of which they have on Sundays and the other of which they have in the middle of the week, etc. And I imagine that Russian Marxism is rather of that sort of Sunday Christianity kind that people have. On the other hand, as various studies of, say, the nomenclatura have made clear, a communist state is extremely precarious so long as there's a free world, because a communist state is in many ways construed as a prison. They have to put barbed wire and walls around to keep people from running off. And therefore it's unsafe so long as there is some place to move to. And therefore what will hold a communist state together will be the necessity of overthrowing non-communist states. If the world eventually became totally communist, I would expect the most horrendously nihilistic situation to arise, because it would simply be conflict between a set of simply ferocious, power-fascinated elites.
Yes, so you'd expect an ideology which flourishes best and most naturally in opposition to continue its opposition once in power, in a sense, i.e. by persecuting dissidents under the pretext that they are counter-revolutionary, and also by expanding, by aggressing against its neighbors. So isn't Soviet behavior inherent in the very formal structure of ideology?
Yes, I think that there's no doubt that in order to understand how, say, Marxists in power act, you have to take the ideology extremely seriously. I mean, people are very foolish who don't think ideas are important, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're carrying out their ideas. On the other hand, ideas of this universal kind are extremely dangerous to the people who hold them. You see, a lot of liberal feminism in the 19th and 20th centuries simply consists in taking seriously the unconsidered abstract remarks in, say, the Declaration of Independence and many other constitutions. Abstract formulae are a kind of time bomb, which one of these days, generation by generation, may go past and nobody takes much notice of them, but then a generation arises that does. And quite a lot of dissidents in the Soviet Union are simply pure Marxists who have actually taken seriously the notion that it ought to be an egalitarian, proletarian state.
Well, might that not as well be said, say, of Christianity here and there in history, for instance, under the Borgias?
Yes.
Probably people who practiced the mandates of the Sermon on the Mount found themselves short-lived under the Borgias.
St. Francis was a very dangerous character, wasn't he? Because the Franciscans became the seedbed of lots of heresies, and the heresies all took this line of Jesus was a poor man, and here are the popes living in these palaces, and so on.
Yeah, but I suppose the critical difference between the two is that the injunctions of Christianity are immortally venerable, while those of communism are historically fallible and indeed have proved to be atrocious in execution, haven't they?
Well, the big difference, of course, is that Christianity has heaven and earth. as imaginative realms within which to operate. Whereas the first move in Marxism, if you want to intensify conflict in order to attain power, you have to remove that imaginative slack of heaven and say heaven is simply a fantasy. Everything is really about who gets what. And once you persuade people of that, you then have the hope of stirring up a vast amount of trouble. So that the denial of religion is the first premise of the ideological intensification of class conflict. Imminent, well, yes.
One of the fascinating insights in your book is your observation that though it purports to be scientific, ideology has the character of revelation, and that one of the devices by which it's handled a lot of its inherent difficulties is to create figures of charismatic authority. Marx appointed himself, so that any difficulty could simply be referred to him, and of course any contradiction could be denied by him. Would you expand that idea a little further for the
well,
so the Supreme Court of Marxism,
yes,
and the standing constitutional
right.
convention.
Yeah, so it's, yes.
Well, there are really 2 points there, in that Marx himself was a genius who not only invented the doctrine, but also knew what was necessary to keep control over it. And the way in which he often kept control over it was by intimidating his subordinates were kept in line by abuse. I mean, he had the most dramatic capacity to abuse and destroy people. Above all, I think his capacity was to convey to people that what he'd discovered was a secret. And the point about describing Marxism as a revelation is this emphasis on secrecy. It's very hard to overestimate the importance of secrecy, and particularly doctrines of secret knowledge in the history of particularly Western thought, but also Eastern thought.
Are these secrets that he allegedly intuited, or that he deduced?
No. They're secrets. They're secrets only in the sense that Marx says other people are trying to keep this from you. You see, I, Marx, am revealing to you the oppressive nature of capitalism. Now, why have you not realized this before? Well, because you've been fed a lot of stuff about religion and law and justice and so on. And in that sense, what I have to say is a secret. Not that I'm trying to whisper it to a set of initiates in a room. I'm shouting it from the rooftops, but it's a secret revealed because nobody else wants you to know. Just as feminists are revealing the secret of patriarchy, which is being concealed by romantic fiction, by the words of the marriage service, by all the institutions, by language, by the institutions of society, so that what part of the exhilaration of taking up an ideology is that you think that you've acquired a secret in the face of the most ferocious pressures from conventional belief and conventional society. I mean,
you have acquired what used to be a secret. When you acquired it, it's no longer a secret, right?
Well, in a sense, it's no longer a secret, but it remains a secret. It remains, you see, it's from other people. Furthermore, it's not one secret. You see, it's a succession of secrets. It's an engine for generating the discovery of further forms of domination which have been concealed.
Yet ideology purports to be direct perception, unmediated.
Yes, the ideological theory of that the mode of production is basic to human society is rammed home by Marx early in his career, particularly in the German ideology, and you get this digestive fundamentalism. Man must eat. Can they not realize that before anybody philosophizes, they must have a full stomach, clothes on their backs, a roof over their heads, and so on? It is the mode of production. He thinks that once you realize that that's true, then you will recognize that being determines consciousness, and that what Hegel and the young Hegelians he was attacking so viciously in that 600-page pamphlet, what they had done was to think that man is pure spirit or pure reason. But what man actually is, said Marx, is a producer, above all, a producer of his material needs. And you go on to man as a social animal and the complicated implications of that doctrine. But have I, you wanted to emphasize the point about revelation, and I have a feeling I've slipped past it.
No, that was fine. I'd like to talk a little about a phenomenon I've been interested in, and Bill too, of course, what we call liberalism here in America, which is no longer like the old liberalism in any important way that I know of. It's taken on, liberalism here has taken on the character of ideology in a negative way in this respect. The ideologist accuses the West in various direct ways. The liberal now accepts the accusation on our behalf. I mean, for a concrete illustration, you see our congressman writing to the communist rulers of Nicaragua, sort of apologizing for Ronald Reagan's behavior. We see this all the time. These are not people who espouse the ideology, but they accept on our behalf its charges against us. They plead guilty for us, like a lawyer who, without consulting his client, enters a guilty plea. Court-appointed lawyer, I might add.
Yes, there is, I suppose, a powerful human disposition to beat one's chest and cry mea culpa. It clears the air, rather.
It's what Jean-Francois Revel is talking about.
Yes.
Isn't he? When he asked, can democracies survive, given that they are sick with their brooding self-accusations, so that when somebody else accuses them, they can't really heartily rebut.
Yes, I've been fascinated by this for quite a long time. It came, I ran into it recently in a talk-in program on famine in Ethiopia, where a number of people in Britain who asked questions were clearly persuaded that we in the West were guilty in some sort of way for the Ethiopian famine. Now, the West has very few direct relations with Ethiopia, and I was puzzled by why they should immediately have this sense of guilt. Now, guilt is the sense of having violated a rule. And the problem, it seemed to me, is what rule could these people thousands of miles away have possibly violated? And I suppose the rule must be something like, thou shalt not be more fortunate or more successful or more equal than anyone else. And along these lines, you see, you might, it's not psychoanalysis, it's a bit like socioanalysis, or an analysis of hidden dimensions of consciousness, that people reading the papers and going to universities and engaged in ordinary political discussion of the kind with which we're familiar, pick up the notion that there is something shady and unseemly about being better fed or better clothed than somebody else. That is, if you put a liberal face-to-face in the third world with somebody starving, they immediately feel uneasy, and I'm sure I would too, and it's one of the characteristics that we have. One of the peculiarities of our civilization, because I don't imagine that a Chinese mandarin confronted by a starving beggar 500 years ago would have had the slightest sensation of guilt in the least. But
is the Vatican gradually infected by this problem?
I don't know. I'm no Vaticanologist, I have to confess. I get the impression that the present Pope is reasonably tough-minded about these things, but there's no doubt that the Catholic Church in the last 20 years has done the most astonishing set of volte-face, hasn't it, on all sorts of things, and I suppose on this as well. My colleague at the London School of Economics, Peter Bauer, has done a number of articles on what he calls ecclesiastical economics, and I suppose the attempt there is to expose the economic illiteracy of many pronouncements by bishops on the Third World, which tend to be of a sort of generalized charitable inclination. And Professor Bauer is very concerned at the mischievous effects of such economic nonsense.
How much of the self-reproach is really sincere? Self-reproach, first person singular, and how much is really disguised accusation? C.S. Lewis once, in an essay on the dangers of national repentance, says that this habit of using the pronoun we when you really mean you, the rest of you, is the virtue, or is the vice of detraction disguised as the virtue of contrition.
That's brilliant, yes. I'm sure that's absolutely it. When people say we are guilty, they don't ever, I think, mean I am guilty, because if you actually want to implicate yourself in it, you would have to use the first person pronoun. You would never say we. So I think
Macbeth said I, didn't he, finally?
Yeah, but he had something very directly to be guilty about, didn't he? That's true. No, I think you're right that we can a priori diagnose hypocrisy whenever people say we are guilty.
I'm thinking more and more that there's a kind of symbiosis between the ideologist and these other people, these liberals I'm talking about, that they're forming a tacit alliance of stronger and stronger bonds. The difference between the way Tip O'Neill talked about President Reagan last week wanting to put troops in Nicaragua, and the way he talked about Gorbachev yesterday as this man of unquestionable frankness and openness and yearning for world peace. I mean, you have to make some allowance for the rhetorical situation at a given moment, but there's no question of the much more bitter animus against our own president, our own leaders, our own authorities, than against those of our enemies, if you can still call them enemies with liberal permission.
You have 10 seconds in which to whinny over that.
The follies of politicians ought not to be visited upon doctrines. Doctrines are very complicated. The central point is that between a genuine constitutional and political liberalism and genuine ideology, the gulf is simply immense. But no doubt there are, in practice and in the world, many intervening stages.
Thank you, Professor Kenneth Minogue, author of Alien Powers. Thank you, Mr. Joseph Sobran. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the Yale College Young Republicans.